Warning. The following podcast features views and opinions that are likely to trigger the extreme fanboys and fangirls who disagree with them. Listener discretion is advised.
And here we go.
Welcome everyone to Hot Takes with Billy Business, brought to you by Reboot It, Season 2, streaming exclusively on YouTube, because guys, you have to see it to believe it. Now today, we are going to do something I've never done before on this show. I've rated and ranked movies and franchises before, but I've never tackled an entire trilogy, which is insane. We're going to do it though. It's going to take 2 weeks. Part 1 is today, and I'm talking Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight Trilogy. Today we're talking Batman Begins and Dark Knight, and here to do that from Hey Do You Remember? He was on the Prometheus episode, one of my most requested guests because he's that good, Mr. Chris Schrader. Chris, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me back. I'm really excited about this, and also there's a lot of pressure too, so.
Well, I think, so we dabbled in it for half a second in Prometheus. I don't think people realize like how integral, or at least people who listen to my stuff maybe don't listen to your show yet. They don't realize how integral Batman as a character is to kind of your whole story.
Yeah, absolutely. The first Tim Burton movie was probably the most formative movie-going experience I've ever had. So this character has meant a whole lot to me, literally my entire life. I can't remember a moment before Batman. So we did a whole episode of my podcast called The Road to Gotham as part of the lead up to covering Batman 89. That's all about my relationship with this character over the course of my life. And so, yeah, if your listeners want to check that out, I would point them in the direction of that. We've done both Burton movies. We've done Batman and Robin, and someday Batman Forever.
There's also another thing I want to bring up, with your production company. It's not just Hey Do You Remember? You have a lot of other podcasts. There's one that you guys do called Wayne Manor Memoirs. And I want to point people specifically to the June 6th, 2019 episode. It's called Unmade Batman Films. You guys did a deep dive into, after Batman and Robin came out, it wasn't a huge failure, but it definitely wasn't a success. And there were a lot of movies on the table that they pitched that could have been made that didn't get made. We're not going to do a deep dive into those on this episode just because we have so much to get through. But Wayne Manor Memoirs, June 6, 2019, there's some wild ones.
Yeah, actually, thank you for mentioning that. That actually is that would be a great tee up to what we're doing here. We charted the whole development from Joel Schumacher was originally going to do, they were planning on doing a third film of his. So we do everything from that right up until Batman Begins. And it is interesting how, for as much as Nolan and Goyer, how much of this they kind of dreamed up, and the whole thing about always picking the villains based on what they wanted to say about Bruce Wayne in each film. There are still elements in Batman Begins where you can see these were seeded through some of these other projects initially. It was really interesting.
Yeah, so there's definitely a long road before Batman Begins. Like I said, June 6th, 2019 episode, Wayne Manor Memoirs. I'll even say pause this and go listen to that first, because I do feel like a lot of those do influence what ends up happening on screen for Batman Begins. But for our purposes, we're going to skip ahead to January of 2003. That's when Warner Brothers he had just come off of Memento. They hired Christopher Nolan to direct a Batman film written by David Goyer. They really wanted to do something very different to that point. They wanted to do the origin story of Batman, which a lot of people said, oh, Batman's origin story, never been done on film. Wrong, sir. It was done in Mask of the Phantasm. It'd never been done in live action film to
Correct.
That point. And I do think we had seen that inciting incident, the shooting of the parents. We had seen it a couple times now in both Batman and Batman Forever. But a full-blown, we got the A and the C, but a lot of the B was missing, how a young Bruce would get to Batman. And I think they wanted to find a way to tell that story while also grounding Batman in a reality that was recognizable, that was contemporary, that was something that you could feasibly understand with a little bit of, disbelief, that a man could in fact, become Batman. And I think that's such an interesting place to start with Batman, especially when you really think about what had come before, which was every Batman movie to that point had to get bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah. Well, I totally agree with that. And actually, even taking a further step back about the development of all of this, I mentioned to you earlier this week that one of the interesting things about this trilogy is that each installment kind of represents a mile marker for the evolution of fandom, not just how this subculture went fully mainstream, but also the evolution of how we talk about comic book movies and what a fan base's relationship to these properties is. And I really do think that each one of them illuminates a different point in that progression. And so with Batman Begins specifically, one of the most influential and impactful things about the approach they took here was that even if this wasn't technically the first reboot of a well-known franchise, it's definitely the one that kickstarted that trend, because 15 years ago, which it's crazy that this movie's 15 years old, but the word reboot wasn't even part of the lexicon when we talked about movies. In fact, the idea was so unfamiliar. Do you remember how many people thought this was a prequel to the first Burton movie?
Oh, absolutely. I remember when my mom saw it for the first time, when he pulls out the Joker card at the end, she's like, oh, Jack Nicholson's.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is all so commonplace now that because we adapted to it so quickly. And so it sends this message to all the other studios that, oh, this can work. Audiences will go with it. And you really can just hit the reset button on some of these big properties. Give yourself a do-over, which is easy to take for granted now when we're on like our third reboot of Spider-Man. But this was a pretty bold idea at the time. The idea that it's like, this has nothing to do with the other versions you've seen before.
You're right. If it hadn't been for Batman Begins, arguable if we'd be on our third Spider-Man 3.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the other aspect of this, another thing that's become commonplace, but that was still fairly new at the time, was the ability to track the entire development of a film online from the moment it's greenlit all the way until opening weekend. And I remember obsessively following websites like Batman on Film and Ain't It Cool News, going through all of those different iterations we just name-checked a few minutes ago, like Darren Aronofsky's Year One and the Batman Beyond live action movie, all that shit. So there was so much indecision on Warner Brothers' part. There was so much wheel spinning, all these aborted projects. And it was this really frustrating, but also honestly, a really exciting time to be all over those message boards, refreshing these home pages, waiting for new headlines. And so from the moment this was announced, I was all over it. And it was one of the first times I walked into a theater knowing that much about a film before seeing it, which is not so rare anymore. Now it's the opposite. Now you really have to go out of your way if you want to walk into a movie cold. At least guys like us, it takes some effort to do that.
You know what's interesting was, I'm a big Batman guy, and my love, which I think a lot of people were actually surprised about, I posted over last summer when the 4K disc releases of the original 4, the Batman anthology, that was the pinnacle for me. Those 4 movies, and I get it, Forever and Robin, sure, but those 4 movies, that was my Batman. Batman Begins comes around, and it's not at all that I'm disinterested. Quite the opposite. I'm cautiously optimistic. But also remember, this came out about a month after my first true love that I can never really abandon and give all my attention to, which was Star Wars. This came out a month after Revenge of the Sith. And I think at that point, people, the prequels are very strange because even though people seem to hate them, the same thousands and millions of people would line up midnight to go see him again. So I feel like even though the 2 prequels had disappointed a lot of people, the fervor and the talk was still very heavy Star Wars in the spring of 2005, to the point where a Batman movie with a whole new cast, a whole new concept, somehow slipped under the radar in a lot of aspects.
Yeah, totally.
I definitely do remember, going to see, I think it was Sin City, in the early spring of 2005. And I think that's the first time I even saw like a poster in the theater for Batman Begins. And I remember it had this very like bronze brown color scheme, and it was 100% desaturated from any other color. I was like, all right, I see you. I'll get to you. I don't know. But when I saw Batman Begins finally on opening night, I was blown away, but it also was like, Star Wars to me felt like the end of something special, and this felt like the beginning of something special, taking from the title Batman Begins. I was kind of blown away the first time that I had seen it there's this misconception, and it does bother me because it's not true. A lot of people say this is the only Batman movie that's about Batman. False. Incorrect. Batman Forever is the first movie where the POV is actually Bruce. The character that goes through an arc is actually Bruce Wayne. I'm not saying it's the best. I'm not even saying they did it well. But the idea that a Batman movie not about Batman, it did happen in Batman Forever. Those performances from those villains overshadowed, but it wasn't like a Batman Returns where the character arcs literally were Selina, Kyle, and Oswald. Like, Batman is almost inconsequential to them. And the first Batman, I would even argue, is kind of Vicky Vale's story. She's the only one that kind of changes by the end. Maybe not. But Batman Forever attempted it. What Batman Begins did, though, they were able to make the story about Batman, about Bruce specifically, in a way that I think was because they decided to choose villains that could take a little bit of a backseat, because that was really the only way that I feel like a true movie where we only focus on Batman was going to happen. And when you think about it, Ra's al Ghul is missing for 2/3 of this movie.
Totally. Yeah. Well, and I remember that was one of the things that I was initially disappointed in the first time I saw this, was that Scarecrow felt a little underserved by this story. But that is one of the consequences of making the decision to focus so heavily on Batman, which I loved. And overall, I really loved this straight away the very first time I saw it. I remember feeling like there were certain aspects of this that I never thought I was going to see in a live action Batman movie. Aspects of the character or of the mythology that I was so excited to see them finally doing justice to. And I think you make an amazing point about Batman Forever. I think that's very valid, but I think both Burton movies and both Schumacher movies, they still ultimately always seem to be just a little bit more interested in the villains. And you said it, like with Batman Returns in particular, they almost forget to give Batman anything to do in that one. So before this, I remember watching Mask of the Phantasm, which for a long time I thought was the best Batman movie, and wondering why we couldn't get a live action version that was more like that. And so seeing Batman Begins opening night, that wound up being pretty gratifying. And I had reservations, of course. I think that's inevitable when you're dealing with a property like this, because every Batman fan has a different attachment to this character, different things we love about him or that speak to us. So you're never going to get an interpretation that checks every single one of the boxes for what you personally want to see in a Batman movie. And so when they, hearing that Scarecrow was going to be the villain, just based on the experience I'd had with that character in the comics and in the animated series, your mind just kind of conjures up a different version of what a Scarecrow live action Batman movie is going to look like. And that's something I had to make peace with, was even just visually, even totally superficially, just the way they present Scarecrow in this movie. That was one of the big things that I was still wrestling with as I walked out of the theater. It took me a while to warm up to that. But, according to Nolan and Goyer, they changed one really important detail of the origin story, which was they get rid of the bat crashing through the window moment from the comics, the I shall become a bat.
Right.
And instead, they take that one moment from Dark Knight Returns of young Bruce falling into the cave, and then this idea that being swarmed by bats and that everything being centered around that fear, and how, so then Scarecrow becomes a very logical villain with that. And then the way that, Ra's al Ghul, how we can integrate that with his training and how that serves this other part of the story. And then it's like they do such a good job of it. It's like you almost don't notice that, Liam Neeson's not in the entire second act of the film.
Yeah, it's pretty insane when you think about it. Like, this movie shows you how willing to go in a different direction they were, when it's like, who's going to be your villain? Ra's al Ghul. Who? Don't worry, we'll have Scarecrow. Huh? And Victor Zsasz will show up. I'd never heard of him. Who's that? Is he an actor? Like, there's three DC Comics Batman bad guys in there that had never, ever been on screen since then. And it's funny because Zsasz has now shown up like in a couple there. He was like a big part of Birds of Prey, strangely enough. But I think that kind of showed that they were looking to do something different. I really loved I think it was fairly obvious to anyone that's ever like watched the cartoon or read a comic book. I think you kind of knew just by like the mustache that Liam Neeson was actually Ra's al Ghul or Ra's al Ghul if you're a animated series fan. But I still loved it's one of the things, like, it's funny because I just recently, I hadn't seen it in a long time, I watched Sherlock Holmes, the one with Robert Downey Jr., and I completely forgot everything about it, but it's kind of about occult stuff. And I just remember halfway through that movie, both in the theater and at home, I was like, if this really is like magic, this is going to be really dumb. And I loved that it was like, no, it was just they found ways around it to make it look like magic. And I love that that's kind of what they do with Ra's al Ghul in this movie. Is Ra's al Ghul immortal, or is it just an elaborate kind of prank where it's like, the Phantom, where it's like, yeah, maybe one dies, but then another pops up. Like the demon's head will always live on. I really liked that aspect. And I think it does, especially if you don't know the character, it makes a great third act twist, or going into the third act twist.
Yeah. I mean, and I obviously will save our thoughts on Dark Knight Rises for now, but that's another one where the third act twist, if you know anything about the comics, like there is no twist. You've seen it coming like the entire movie, but it doesn't spoil the movie in any way. Like I said, they do such a good job of making Bruce Wayne such a compelling character that you don't notice that the villains are not factoring in as heavily in this story.
Yeah, it's actually, I used Ra's al Ghul as a kind of defense of Spider-Man Far From Home, and people are like, oh, the Mysterio thing I knew. It's like, yeah, but you knew Liam Neeson was the bad guy in Batman Begins. You didn't care. It was fine. Shut up.
Yeah.
The one thing that I do like about Batman Begins a little more than its sequels, and this is one aspect that, especially watching it now, it does make it stand out. I personally, when it comes to comic book movies, I like to have one foot in a world I understand and the other foot in something that could never be. And I think as Marvel movies have gone, they've done a good job of kind of introducing the latter half of that, which is a little more of the fantastical. Batman Begins really rides that line. And I'm talking mostly about kind of its production design in terms of like Gotham City. To me, when I think of Gotham City, when I read a comic book or something, I'm still very heavily influenced by the first two Burton films in terms of what I like Gotham City to look like. I feel like they took Chicago and they threw in just enough with like the monorail and the Narrows that it still felt a little bit comic booky, a little bit, not a lot, but enough. I feel like they completely abandoned that later on. But for this one,
I totally agree. And when we get to the Dark Knight, there's actually a reason that one just firmly is like, no, Gotham City is just Chicago, essentially. Right. That they felt empowered to do that. And that also, it's one of the things I love the most about Batman Begins, is at the time it felt so grounded compared to the super stylized, the previous four Batman movies, especially Batman and Robin. And then it's like, yeah, but then after the next two, this one really does, it looks so much more stylized than I think it even felt at the time. And I've always said, I want Gotham City to feel like a character. I want it to have a personality. And so I totally agree. That I also love that about this one.
Yeah, I definitely think that it's very strange if you watch this trilogy today, especially like one after the other, just the progression of like, I don't want to say he was embarrassed by comic books, but it definitely feels like this first one was like a 2/3 Nolan vision, 1/3 compromise of studio notes,
Absolutely. I was thinking the exact same thing watching that this one does feel like the one where he probably had to make the most concessions or compromises. And then I don't think it's any accident that from The Dark Knight on, the aesthetic of his films even when he stops working with Wally Pfister as a cinematographer, they all look of a piece, whereas this one really stands out now.
It's even like color timed slightly different than the last two. It's just and it's not a bad thing. It definitely doesn't feel like, oh, this feels like I'm watching a completely different thing. No, but it's very subtle, especially when you watch them all together. But I do definitely think there were compromises in, like, I don't want to say, when you say that there are some problems with the script, you're implying, or maybe people infer that you mean that, like, structurally there are problems. And I don't necessarily think that they're structural, but there are definitely things in this script that feel like, oh, someone told you had to put that in there. And for me, the most obvious, like, this scene is so weird to me every time I watch it. I can't even remember, Rutger Hauer, whatever his character's name is, just sitting all by himself in this massive boardroom, and this guy comes in, he's like, hey, you know that MacGuffin thing that's going to become important later? It's gone. Uh-huh. And then it's like,
yeah,
you're like, what?
This is actually one of my bullet points, is that exact scene. There is so little I would change about this movie before the introduction of the microwave emitter. Like, I think that's the moment. From that point on, that's where they start having some trouble walking that tightrope between keeping everything grounded while also being a comic book movie. It's not a bad setup for a third act, like, trapped on that island, the inmates escaping Arkham. It's a great set piece, but it does clash a little bit with the first 2/3 tonally. It feels more soundstagey, which, again, it's a great set. I love the way all of it looks. It just really stands out in comparison to the way everything else had been staged up to that point. It's my biggest criticism of the film. The third act still has a lot of highlights, but it's also definitely the weakest section of the movie.
It just definitely feels like this movie prides itself on being so meticulous with the details.
Right.
And it's almost like they shot the whole movie, and it's like, all right, well, if Batman has to have this in his butt cheek so that if he farts, that's why it would happen. that they totally forgot, like, oh, we didn't even set up at all like this device, which is, when I was watching it this time, I was like, oh man, that very first time you see a full boardroom, why weren't they just talking about this product and that's it? Just put it in there. Like, Chekhov's gun, just put it at the beginning so you don't have to explain it to me awkwardly. He's just sitting by himself in this huge boardroom, like Kirk Cameron eating a Subway sandwich. And I'm like, what are you doing in there? Like, you don't have an office? Like, this is so strange. But other than that, like, that's why I said, like, I don't think it's like a structural problem necessarily. There's just some parts that are, the other thing that drives me bonkers about this movie is the amount of callback lines that they have. I can't handle it. I think one or two can be very effective. It's not who I am underneath, but what I do that defines me.
Yeah.
Great. Or why do we fall? You can have those two, but then you add those two, and then you have didn't you get the memo? Or our company, like they do it.
Yeah.
So, you never mind your surroundings. It's like, no. You get 2. You don't get 8.
I don't know. I'm not going to put such a harsh restriction on it as you, but I hear what you're saying. I do like a lot of them. And it's something that, one of the things I love about the first Back to the Future movie is that when you go back and watch it a second time, it's just like, oh my God, I'll be damned. There is like barely a line wasted here. Everything is set up for something that's going to pay off later. And I like a lot of that in this movie, but I do think didn't you get the memo? That one, that's getting a little too cute. And that's also a weird scene, by the way, with Rutger Hauer's character, where that every time I watch the movie, it feels like the scene where he tells Morgan Freeman he's firing him. It feels like 30 seconds of that got cut out. Like the way they jump to, I'm closing this department and I'm firing you. That does not sound like he's responding to the last thing Morgan Freeman said. It was just like, oh shit, we took a turn. Okay.
Yeah, it's definitely like, hey, have you heard about this thing? Yeah, I think so. Great. I hate you. You're fired. Like, whoa. Go eat your Subway sandwich by yourself, sir, and calm down. It's, again, like you're going to find this in every Christopher Nolan movie. I do think that it really is a Goyer thing. I really do think. I think he was just so proud of himself that there were so many callbacks, but it was almost like it was pop quizzing me if I'd been paying attention this whole time. Like, yes, I remember that scene. I get it.
Well, something when you were talking about just the structure of the movie, something that reminded me of is that on this viewing in particular, I was really struck by how much it mirrors the structure of the first Richard Donner Superman movie, in that, that film has 3 distinct chapters that are almost treated like 3 different genres. It has the stuff on Krypton, and then it moves into the Americana, Norman Rockwell style coming of age stuff in Smallville. And then from there, it's on to Metropolis, where he really sets the template for what Nolan does here. And that's treating all of the superhero stuff seriously and grounding it in the real world as much as possible, playing it straight, giving it verisimilitude. And then here in Batman Begins, you've also got 3 different chapters. You've got the traveling the world stuff and all of the flashbacks in the first act. Then there's a second act that's largely devoted to, it's almost a pulpy Batman versus the mob story. And then a third act that, like we've said, goes full comic book movie with the siege on the city and the water vaporizer. So they're not as visually distinct from one another as the different sections of Superman, but I would argue that Nolan is deliberately playing with different genre tropes in each act, which is another thing that's a lot of fun about this movie.
I mean, you're not wrong. He is flat out cited Richard Donner's 1978 Superman movie as like a heavy influence on the way that he wanted to tell this story. And I think there's a reason why Kevin Feige even says, like, before we make a Marvel movie, we watch that movie. It's definitely the prototype, and it's not the argument anymore of like who did it first. It's like who's doing it best. And I think this is taking there's only 5-6 different stories in the history of literature. We just tell the same stories in different ways. I think he tells the story in a really good way, and that's why, like, when I nitpick things, like the guy just sitting alone in the boardroom, that's what it is. It's a nitpick.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, when I look at this movie, the other thing that does kind of like it's strange because, again, when you watch these, 1, 2, and 3 together, you can tell that the first movie, he's like, I don't really know how to shoot action, but it seems like this Bourne Identity way of doing it is the way people like it. And people are like, no. That by the time we get to the Dark Knight and Batman and Dark Knight Rises, it is painfully awkward, the action scenes, watching them like, like, oh, you gotta cut this a little bit different. I just think like Nolan does great action sequences, but not great fights. And this movie's, it's really hard to tell what Batman is actually doing some of the time.
This is one of that's a common criticism with Nolan's films. I think it's deserved. And this is one of the worst examples. A lot of it is disorienting. And there are sequences where you can go, okay, maybe that's sort of what they were going for. Like Batman's first appearance, where it is just this chaos and what the hell is
great.
This thing?
I love that warehouse dock scene is, I think, maybe some of the best Batman ever committed to film. That whole sequence, start to finish, I think is everything I ever wanted in a Batman movie when I saw it.
Yeah. Well, so the fighting style that they used for Batman Begins, I can't remember the name of it now. KC maybe? It starts with a K. But it's all about very close quarters combat. That's why you see a lot of like elbows, and it's a very narrow range of movement, which makes a lot of sense for the character, I guess. But cinematically, I don't know that it's necessarily the most fun to watch.
Yeah. I mean, like, again, and that's where it's just this interpretation of Batman. It's all about functionality, whereas before we were sacrificing substance for style. In some cases with Batman Begins, it's the other way around. It's like, maybe this doesn't look as good, but if he was really doing this is probably, he would use short strikes and get in and out,
Yeah. Well, along those same lines, and speaking of nitpicks, they give a reason for why every piece of the suit is being utilized and why it looks the way it does and why it's going to do the thing it's going to do. And I do think a lot of that is very cool. One of my other big criticisms walking out of it the first time was like, shit, man, I wish they had done more to distance this costume from the previous films. That you can call it whatever military term you want. At the end of the day, this is still just another black rubber batsuit.
Okay, so I hear you. I actually like the Begin suit is my favorite Batman suit.
Okay.
Not just for the functionality, but I do think like, I always was like, yeah, I grew up with like Adam West Batman. That was the one that initially turned me on to the character when I was like 3 years old. So I was like, what would it look like if it was kind of blue and black or whatever? I think we started to get towards George Clooney like a bluish black, and I just didn't feel right to me. And I feel for like this character, it's kind of almost a shame that they went so realistic with it in the earlier movies, because it makes the most sense that it would be kind of a black rubber suit. No?
I don't know, maybe. And look, listen, it's a perfectly fine suit, and there are things I prefer about it. I don't like the overly designed bat suits, and so that's going to be one of my complaints with the next two movies. But it's just, especially in 2005, when you're trying to fight this perception that this is a prequel to the 89 movie, that it's going to tie in somehow. I think this was another area where the title does them no favors. It sounds like a prequel. And then also when you just see a picture of the suit, it's just like, oh, right. Yeah, that's the bat suit. I think the suit is fine. I just think it would have been cool to see a different take on the bat suit.
It's really hard, like they tried, with Superman to kind of go a different route, and it was pooped all over. I mean, there were other, mitigating circumstances, but it's kind of hard when you have that piece of iconic, like Americana almost with Batman, and any small tweak is going to raise the ire. Maybe not at that time, because like you said, the internet fandom was not quiet, but it certainly wasn't as accessible and vocal as it is now. So I don't know. Maybe they could have gotten away with a more radical redesign in 2005 than, say, like Robert Pattinson's new suit.
Oh, I mean, I'm not even saying like a radical redesign. I think as long as you maintain that silhouette, you're in pretty good shape. I just mean even something as immediately striking as the first time you see a picture of Michael Keaton in the costume and go, oh my God, it's all black. Like, that's not, my first reaction to that as a child was like, oh, that's not Batman. The color's wrong. They must have done something wrong with the printing. And then it's just like, but it works for that film. And then you adjust, and then that sets a new precedent. Again, this is a nitpick. This is not a huge issue for me.
You brought up Michael Keaton, so let's talk about one aspect we haven't really dove into yet, which is the actors, the performers in this movie. And first and foremost, I don't know a lot of people who knew who Christian Bale was before this movie. There were definitely, he was in movies. It's not like he wasn't around, but Christian Bale was not a well-known name. I certainly didn't know who he was when they cast him. And it wasn't until that first teaser, which, by the way, that first teaser trailer
it's amazing.
It's perfect.
Yeah.
It's perfect. But I definitely think that although Christian Bale isn't my favorite Batman, he is by far my favorite Bruce.
I think that's fair. And so I really liked American Psycho. I loved him in that movie. So Christian Bale was on my radar, but this is still sort of a Superman the movie strategy, which was Christopher Reeve, largely unknown, but we're going to surround him with all of these really well-known, prestigious actors. Same strategy they use here. This is, his voice, I think, is going to become a bigger issue as the films go on. But that's another thing about Batman Begins, where it's kind of unfairly lumped in with the other two. I feel like they do not go that overboard with the voice in this one, except in moments where it's like, he's got the guy hanging upside down and he's intimidating him. But like, when it's him talking to Rachel, the first time he gives her that leverage to use against Judge Faden, he's not doing the voice that everyone makes fun of. Like, there are different pitches to it in this one.
No, definitely. This one is, I don't think they added kind of that growl to it that they would later on. And it's strange because even though it's not by his own accounts, he looks more comfortable as Batman in this movie than he does in later movies where it looks like he's in physical agony with his mouth hanging open like Napoleon Dynamite when he's not speaking a lot of times in the other movies.
Yeah.
The one that just pulls me out, and we'll get to it, but Dark Knight Rises, where he's giving Catwoman the
This
Bat
is
Pod.
exactly what I was thinking. This is the exact moment I was thinking of when you said that. It totally ruins this really important moment.
Not yet. Not everything. I was like, close your mouth.
It's like you should feel all the feels in that moment. And instead you're just like Batman, the mouth breather. Like, what do we?
That's why, like, with Batman Begins, I feel like for whatever reason he had a better handle, and I actually like this Batman from Batman Begins is probably my favorite interpretation of Christian Bale's for the three. I think he gets better material later on, but I feel like for some reason just like he felt most comfortable as this version of Batman, and that's why I really do enjoy Batman Begins. It stands on its own, and I think that Christian Bale really does, like, he has a better Bruce Wayne moments later on, but I definitely think overall, like, for the first time out the gate with such heavy expectations of being a Batman, Christian Bale just knocks it out of the park.
This is definitely the one he seems to be most invested in. That's how I feel watching it. And it's crazy when, if you have the Blu-ray set of the whole trilogy and you can watch screen tests from some of the other actors they were considering, and how Nolan said that what got Christian the job was that he was the actor that best understood that you can't just put that suit on and expect it to do all the work, which is funny because that's actually what Michael Keaton said about playing Batman, was that's exactly the approach he took. But that there's just something that doesn't work if you just show up and you don't adjust your voice or your stance or your physicality. And that Christian Bale understood that you do have to give a more heightened performance. Your performance has to match what the suit is doing visually. And he was like the one actor they looked at that really keyed in on that. You know what else is crazy is I'm just remembering that. So those websites I mentioned at the beginning, like Batman on Film in particular, those message boards, years before this movie came out, before anything was announced, and I think mostly because of American Psycho, anytime anyone made a list of fan casting their Batman movie, Christian Bale was always the first choice for Batman. And so when that headline broke, when that story broke, I was just like, no way. Like, that never happens.
They don't listen to fans.
Yeah, it was so crazy.
I think the thing too that you said he's most invested, and I think for me the reason why he gets to do this a little bit in Dark Knight but not nearly as much, he actually gets to play three distinctly different characters in this movie. He plays Bruce kind of unfiltered as himself, he plays kind of rich douchebag Bruce, and he gets to play Batman, and he plays all three of them very differently. And I think that's pretty incredible that, he's the same. It's the Holy Trinity. It's the same guy, but three different facets of this guy. I really do think that Batman Begins is like a shining moment for Christian Bale. I think one of the other standout performances for me is, even accent problems aside sometimes, is Gary Oldman. Here's a character. Now, see, here's the thing. Christian Bale had so much to live up to because people loved Michael Keaton and everyone had their idea of what Batman should be. Commissioner Gordon, it is a compliment if I say that he is an afterthought in those first four movies. That is giving it way more credit. And no disrespect to Pat Hingle, but he just wasn't important to those stories. Jim Gordon is so crucial to this trilogy that you had to really step up your game. And I think it really did make a difference. That's like, oh, Gary Oldman is going to do a comic book movie, especially at that time. Nowadays, Cate Blanchett is in a Thor movie. You're like, yeah, sure, why not? But at that time, Gary Oldman saying, yeah, I will do a Batman movie. That was big time. It definitely told you in that casting alone that they were taking this seriously.
Yeah. Well, and also the other thing about that point in time was the idea of him playing such a wholesome character struck a lot of people as kind of odd. There was a little bit of blowback on that. And I know that some of the other names they had been talking about before him, I think Chris Cooper was who they really went after for the part, and he just wasn't interested. And there's just, as much as I love Chris Cooper as an actor, there is a warmth to Gary Oldman's performance in this. And I think by The Dark Knight is where Gordon really gets to shine. But just even here, that was one of the things that was so gratifying the first time I watched this, was just finally someone had done justice to the Batman Commissioner Gordon relationship, which is so essential. And like you said, had been completely missing from the other movies. There is like 1 10-second stretch, if even that, in Batman Returns, where Batman and Gordon are doing a walk and talk. And I was just like, oh my God, there it is. And then it's just over before it even starts. And that was as close as they came.
By the way, this is a total aside, but that is Batman Returns. I have such a love for it. That's the only part of that movie I'm like, take it out. I don't like it. This version of Batman is not just walking around the streets, just hanging out. You've not set that up. You've set him up as kind of this creature. That all aside.
He's juggling some change. Has anyone seen a vending machine? I am parched. Did you see that shit I just did back there?
Let me just program my bad computer. Excuse me. I do think Gary Oldman, he's not 100% consistent through this trilogy, and we'll get to it later because I think Dark Knight Rises, I have some big Oldman issues, and even the Dark Knight, sometimes I'm like, I feel like he just can't quite nail the American accent. All the bills in the vault were mocked bills, and I was like, whoa, what? That was 5 different accents in there. What are you talking about? But I think all those nitpicks aside and easy kind of joke targets, I think what really made Batman Begins stand out, and something I guess I didn't even really think about until recently, is like, you know, one of the major kind of themes for me of this movie is Bruce keeps looking for a father figure in the absence of Thomas. And he really does find it in both. I think he finds it a little bit in each kind of mentor in his life, definitely in Alfred and Gordon, and in a character I didn't even know anything about until this movie came out, Lucius Fox, who is such a great addition to the on-screen Batman mythos. I know he was, you know, in the 70s and 80s stories, but I wasn't keenly aware of that character, and they certainly don't go out of their way to kind of include him like in the animated series a lot or anything like that. I really just loved Bruce's relationship with all these father figures, and then the wrong father figure with, you know, Ra's al Ghul.
Yeah, totally. Well, just really quick, Lucius, that was another thing that was really cool to see in live action. And although I appreciate that his function in this trilogy is, I mean, he's Q essentially to Batman's James Bond, there is a part of me that wishes we saw a little bit more of Bruce building, designing some of this stuff rather than just always, oh, I need some gear, I'm going to go make a shopping trip to, you know, Lucius's department. That was another one where it was just like the actor they got to play the role, how much he brings to this with a limited amount of screen time. And you're absolutely right with the father figure thing, and especially how Ra's winds up becoming this distorted mirror, funhouse mirror version of Thomas. That's really cool.
Yeah, I definitely think that's one of the, you know, when we said earlier that this movie is about Bruce and about Batman and taking a step back with the villains, I definitely think this is how they compensated, was, you know, finding these father figures so that when this other father figure to Bruce comes in, like you said, it does do what they always did with the Batman villains, which is finding a mirror to something in Bruce's life. In this case, it just happened to be the mentors and the father figures he had surrounded himself with, which I thought was great. And look, anytime you get Liam Neeson in your movie, even in a crap movie, Liam Neeson is 9 times out of 10 great.
You know, the one thing that does irk me every time I watch it, though, is the way he goes out. Like, the like this
It's
is
like, oh, phooey, and then just puts his head down.
well, but not just that, but but Batman's line to him about like, I don't have to kill you, but I don't have to save you. Like, look, this is certainly an improvement over machine guns on the Batmobile, cutting down the Joker's thugs, or blowing up dudes with dynamite. But I'm just not sure how I feel about a Batman whose moral code is based around loopholes and technicalities, and that like this version of Batman, his one rule is I sometimes never kill.
He doesn't kill with guns. I think, like, if you look at the fine print of Batman's rule sheet, he doesn't kill with weapons or with his fists. But negligence, that was never up for debate.
As he flies out of that train, he's just like, still counts, bitch. And I'm out.
And that's why I just love that look of Liam Neeson was just like, he got me there. Closes his eyes, and then just the most over the top, hilarious explosion for what feels like 2.5 minutes of just explosion, which is, I love it. It's great. But the visual of him flying around this kind of, as we end that scene, I love that. There's there's two kind of other major performances I at least want to touch upon. I think Michael Caine as Alfred is, for me, the definitive version of that character. I think there's a lot about Alfred that he's great comedic relief for a lot of the scenes, but a lot of his meat is going to come a little bit later. I think this was a great kind of a great kind of entrance for the character. The other one that I want to touch upon is, and then I'll get your comments, is Rachel, because when I saw this movie, I was like, I don't think Rachel is a Batman character, and it took me a while to figure out it definitely wasn't, but I think we kind of get an upgrade in the next one, personally.
I used to think that my unpopular opinion about this was that I actually preferred Katie Holmes, that I didn't think she was amazing, but that I just really didn't like Maggie Gyllenhaal in The Dark Knight. I think she's a great actress, but I think there was, one of her first scenes is her and Dent walking down the hallway about like, if you're Gotham's DA, you're not getting shot at, you're not doing your job right. There was something about the way she played that scene where I was just like, I don't like this character anymore. Was pretty neutral on her before. Now just sort of a strong dislike. I don't think she has a ton of chemistry with Christian Bale. When they kiss, I feel like I'm watching a brother and sister kiss. And, but I think it's like Rachel is not the standout of either of the movies she appears in, but rather than making it like a Katie Holmes versus Maggie Gyllenhaal thing, I think the fact of the matter is neither actress is that well served by the scripts for these movies.
I think it does hurt the next movie that it's not the same actress, because that moment inevitably loses a big punch emotionally, because you almost treat her as a different character in the next movie because it's so radically different. Because I think Rachel in Batman Begins is still, I interpret it as she's kind of new-ish to her role, and she's still kind of finding her footing. And she's not quite as aggressive in this movie, but by the time we get to the next one, that is a hardened, I've done a million cases. I get shot at every day on my way in and way out. Like, it's just a very different attitude. We're talking like Sarah Connor, Terminator 1 to Terminator 2. It feels like two completely different people. So while I like the latter kind of interpretation of that character, it doesn't feel like I'm losing a character that I got to know, from the other movie.
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing I remember thinking at the time too was, I know it's a big summer blockbuster, he's got to have a love interest. And there's something about the fact that because Nolan is so adamant that we treat these as just one film, we're not thinking about a trilogy or sequels. It's just, we're going to put everything we have into this one film. And there are a lot of ways in which I think the three films are better for that, but there are also other ways where then when you look at them as a whole, you go like, it wouldn't have hurt to maybe have seeded just a few things a little bit earlier. One of them, and it's along those same lines about a relationship that you just don't feel as much as you maybe want to. I think Harvey Dent is the exact same thing, that if instead of Rachel Dawes, it's Harvey Dent, either like as an assistant DA or being groomed for that position. If you get him involved that early on, then I think it's the same thing where you just feel more at the end of the second movie when that storyline goes where it's inevitably going to go. And I think in one of the earlier drafts of the script, Rachel's boss was Harvey Dent, and they decided, no, we're not interested in seeding things. We're not going to think too much about what comes next. This is just its own thing. And so, which is kind of crazy. I feel like it still would have worked even if...
I mean, yeah, it's like you can still take for face value that like Billy D. Williams, Harvey Dent, even though he doesn't get to do anything in that movie, he's still just like, yeah, if you need a DA, might as well just make it Harvey Dent.
Yeah,
not,
I don't think any of the live action movies have successfully mined that Bruce Wayne, Harvey Dent relationship as much as they could have. Obviously, the intention with the Burton movie was somewhere down the line, Billy D. Williams is going to play Two-Face. That never panned out. And so again, it's the same thing where you treat the Batman Forever Two-Face as a brand new character. And I kind of think The Dark Knight, as successful as it is, I just... the Dent stuff would have hit even harder if they had gotten him involved early on here.
I don't disagree with you. I definitely think it probably would have added a lot of layers, you know, in an ideal world if Dent is in this movie and one of the two actresses plays the same Rachel character in both movies. Then I think you really get that desired effect. But, you know, if we're just looking at Batman Begins in a bubble, you're right. I think Rachel serves her purpose just fine. I don't think Katie Holmes is bad by any stretch of the imagination. I think she gets what we still kind of unfortunately were giving the parts in comic book movies to women that we did in the like late 90s, early 2000s, where it's like you're going to scream at the top of a building until our costume hero comes and gets you. She gets a little bit more respect than that, but not a whole lot more respect than that in this movie. So before we wrap out Batman Begins, one last thing I want to talk about, because for whatever reason, this seems to be such a huge deal whenever you do a new Batman movie. It's who's going to be Batman, who's going to be the villain, what's the suit, and the Batmobile.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the Tumbler?
I wasn't crazy about it at the time. I remember that was another thing on Batman on Film when the first photos of it came out. I was just like, huh. And I just kept looking at it, just like waiting for eventually I'm going to like this. And I just wasn't crazy about it, but it taught me a very important lesson, which is you have to wait to see these things in context. That, set pictures, especially, that's why I'm reserving judgment on all the Robert Pattinson stuff until the movie is out. I'll just see how it plays in context, because separate from that, sometimes these things just look a little strange. But seeing the way it's used in the movie, it's funny that they're so embarrassed of even just the word Batmobile that we can't even call it that anymore. But that chase scene with the tumbler, it's like, that is one of the highlights of the movie for me. It's one of my favorite pieces on the score. I think Molossus is the name of that track. And it's also one of the most ridiculous things too, where when he gets back and Alfred's like, look at this, you're lucky no one was killed. I'm just like, oh, no one was killed.
That's one of the other things too, that sequence. I love that sequence, but there definitely is one too many, it's like they had 3 really good cop jokes.
Oh my God.
And they couldn't decide which one to use. They're like, what if we just put them all in there? Like one of those Judd Apatow Line-O-Rama things where it was just like one cop joke. You get one, pick the one that you like the best, but you don't get to do a whole, what
else too is the guy that goes, at least tell me what it looks like. That same actor is also playing a different cop right before that. So it's just, it's like, and they're not even trying to obscure it. He gets like 2 pretty good close-ups, and it's just like, maybe they're twin brothers? They both work on the force. I don't know. But yeah, there's so much cutting away, like to the, like, I'm coming right up on his butt, where it just like at a certain point.
Yeah, it's pick one and let's get through this. Let's get to the next part. Yeah. Ultimately, though, something we didn't talk about. I don't have much to say, but when they did use the Scarecrow, they used it so cool when he first gasses Batman.
Yeah.
And it's like the worms coming out of like his.
It's so good.
I could have had so much more of that, but what we got was amazing.
Well, and then even when Batman turns it around on him, that demonic version of Batman with the ooze dripping out of his mouth, it's just like, oh, shit, man. So when you can lean into this stuff, and when you do, it's pretty awesome. I also love the way he looks when he comes riding out on that horse in the straitjacket and the mask, and then it's just like you think, oh, here we go, and then no, he goes out like such a bitch.
I mean, Scarecrow does kind of like a poor guy. Like it is like in all respect, it's kind of a doofy character. Like his powers are cool, but it's just like a tall, lanky guy with straw coming out of his sweater. It's like, So I do think that he does get to, I like that they bring him back in each movie.
Yeah.
I think the third time maybe would have been, or, one too many. I would have only done one of them, but what can you do? I still like Cillian Murphy.
Yeah, and he auditioned for Batman, and they were like, well, he's not quite right for this, but we like him so much that yeah, I think he's a great fit in that role. Do you know that Nolan had to be talked into even giving him the mask? That David Goyer said that was something he was like, okay, we can get rid of the straw and the hat and all the rest of it, but like, dude, you got to at least put him in the mask.
I mean, yeah, I think that would have been, we would have gone back to like a Dolph Lundgren Punisher era if they hadn't done the mask, because then it's not really Scarecrow.
Yeah.
You can't call it Scarecrow.
No, absolutely. Well, and he said the same thing. I think at one point they were considering not giving Batman a cape, and that he just realized almost immediately it's not Batman without the cape. It just turns into this like SWAT guy with, some ears on his helmet, but it's not Batman. The last thing I wanted to say about Batman Begins as we wind this part down is some of the influences on this movie are very obvious. Like they take moments right out of Batman Year One. This version of Gordon is very similar to that comic. There's a little bit of the Long Halloween in here, but also this movie's pulling a lot from Batman in the 70s, which is this criminally overlooked period. And I don't want to dwell on this for too long and bore you to tears, but there is one part of this that I do think is really interesting. And that is like, in the late 60s, the popularity of Batman comics was really dwindling. That Adam West show had been this cultural phenomenon, and like when it premiered in 1966, it was just like the biggest thing going. And so because of that, the comics of that era started to reflect the sensibilities of that show. They got a little more outlandish and a little more colorful and a little bit silly. And that Adam West show may have burned bright, but it also burned fast. By the third season, interest had dwindled, the world had moved on, and the sales of the comic also reflected that. They reflected that disinterest. So then this writer named Denny O'Neil comes along, he takes over the monthly Batman comic, and his whole approach was to shed all of those campier elements, bring the character back to his roots, and get some of the fans back that they had lost along the way. This is where Ra's al Ghul is created, or Ra's al Ghul, if you want to use O'Neill's pronunciation. This is where the Joker becomes a dangerous and violent madman again, where the detective side of Batman takes center stage. And so together with artists like Neil Adams and Marshall Rogers and other writers like Steve Englehart and Len Wein, they spent the better part of that decade resuscitating this character. So even though Frank Miller usually gets all the credit for that because Dark Knight Returns was released in 1986. What these guys were doing in the 70s, that's this pivotal first step. They had to crawl so Frank Miller could walk. And the reason I bring that up is it's fitting that there is so much of that era in the DNA of not only Batman Begins, but I think in the next one as well. Because those comics and this film were in the same position. Like the comics were trying to shake off the influence of the Adam West show. And then this movie had to try and make everyone forget about Batman and Robin. And then both that era of the comics and this movie wind up getting overshadowed by what the next step in that evolution is going to be. In the comics, it's Dark Knight Returns. And in the movies, Dark Knight obviously completely wound up overshadowing this film, which was successful, but it wasn't like a gigantic hit.
No, that's I'm glad you said that, because that's what I wanted to, that's kind of the lasting thought of this movie was once the success of The Dark Knight was apparent and it became like a happening, there was kind of this misconception that this trilogy started with a bang, and it didn't.
Right.
This did fine. I think their expectations were very low because they knew it's so crazy, the story that you just told, because history literally repeated itself. Batman had gone, it had burned so bright, as much as people don't even want to think about it, with Batman Forever. I think it hit like its apex. And then it was out with Batman and Robin, and the thought of doing another Batman movie, I don't know if a lot of people were into it. So they didn't think that a lot of people were going to show up, and people did show up, but not in droves. I think this movie definitely is one that found a second life after The Dark Knight, or maybe right before it in the frenzy. But I definitely think the legacy of Batman Begins has only aged like a fine wine as time goes on. It was appreciated well enough in 2005, but 2020, 15 years later, it definitely took on like a life that it the perception, the legend is bigger than the summer of 2005, where it was one of 4 or 5. Like, I remember more people in my circle, at least, talking about the upcoming Fantastic Four movie than Batman Begins.
Yeah. What? Well, because it was just kind of a tarnished brand at that point. And whether it's, Denny O'Neil's comics or Nolan's Batman Begins, neither one is reinventing Batman so much as they are just rekindling this other iteration that had just been out of the public consciousness for too long. And so what I think Warner Brothers was really encouraged by was, even if this didn't, explode in the same way Batman 89 had or Batman Forever had, the reviews were really good. They were very encouraged by the reception, both from the critics and from the audiences. Like that gave them the confidence not only to push ahead with this franchise, but also to let it sit for a while, like to put 3 years in between this and the next one.
It's almost ironically meta, watching that last scene of Bruce as the Wayne Manor's been destroyed, and maybe that's a stand-in for the Batman franchise. Like, what are you going to do next? Rebuild it brick by brick. And that's exactly what we left off on. In any other movie, or I should say in any other year, if Batman Begins to come out, the final scene of Batman Begins would have been a post-credit scene. But instead, there wasn't a thing yet, so we got to enjoy and savor this promise of, now you understand our style, now you understand what Batman is to us, we're going to take on the Joker now.
You're absolutely
like,
right that the Joker card, that's an after-credits scene now. But it's one of the things I love about the movie is that if you want to take it as a tease for a sequel, you can. But to me, it's always just felt more like we told a complete story. This is the end point, that when that title comes up on the screen at the end, that's a deliberate choice. That it's just like, we went on this whole journey with this guy. We just went on a 2.5-hour answer to Jack Nicholson's Joker's question of where does he get those wonderful toys? And now, cut to black, Batman Begins. That's the beginning is the end of the movie. I think it works perfectly as a self-contained story as well.
Yeah, definitely more so than any of the other movies that are about to come. It kind of does what a lot of trilogies do, where that first one is like, all right, people like this. Let's now tie 2 and 3 together,
Yeah.
So for me, moving into, now we're in 2006, 2007, and I knew that, a sequel was coming. And when they announced it was going to be called The Dark Knight, my first thought was like, wow, no Batman. They're going for it. They really trust us. I don't know if they should, but they do. And then the casting of Heath Ledger as the Joker. I remember, probably for me, one of the reasons why this movie got on my, Batman Begins was on my radar. I knew it was happening. And if their trailer came out, I was very excited. I wasn't like you, obsessively looking at the stuff for it. For Batman Begins, for The Dark Knight, oh boy, I was, I might as well have been hanging out in, Christopher Nolan's trash can, waiting for something. And I think part of it has to do with what is now maybe a little more commonplace, but at the time, one of the most legendary marketing rollouts I've ever seen for anything ever.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the whole campaign built around what they're not showing you, of like, there's just this sense that they're guarding this really amazing secret. Just an incredible way to get you to like lean in, to invite you to participate. Which is actually kind of fitting. There's that line from the Joker in the movie about like, what do I have to do to get you off the sidelines and into the game? And that's exactly what they were doing with the buildup to all of this.
What was crazy was they, in the spirit of what that first movie was, the thesis was, what would happen if Batman was real? How would that happen? They decided to kind of double down. It was like, well, what if Harvey Dent was real? What if the Joker was real? I remember the first real kind of like, whoa, this movie's going to be something different was I was living in Fullerton, California at the time, in my first apartment, and I got a phone call. And I answered the phone, and it was Harvey Dent leaving a message to vote for him for his re-election for district attorney. Aaron Eckhart recorded this thing, and I was like, this is unbelievable. I can't believe this. Then it turned into, they didn't have a presence at Comic-Con the year before, but what they did was without a booth, without anything, they just spread Joker playing cards all around. And now we get viral stunts like that at Comic-Con all the time. But back then, people were finding these cards, not even 100% sure maybe what it was for, leading them to websites where if they cracked these codes, it would unleash like another puzzle piece to a puzzle piece, and maybe it would lead to a trailer. But then if you crack this other code, the trailer was vandalized by the Joker. Like, it was insane.
Yeah.
The amount. And I feel like, yes, I understand that a lot of people, the talk of this movie ramped up when Heath Ledger passed away, but I think that kind of undersells and rewrites history in a way that the buzz wasn't already like 5 times, 10 times bigger than it was for the last movie.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is the closest a summer has come to feeling like the Batmania of the summer of '89 since then. I mean, it really, there was like an electricity surrounding this film. Even, you're right, but even before Heath Ledger passed.
Yeah, there was just such an air of mystery because I remember the first look at the Joker was a behind the scenes still of them shooting the bank prologue, and he's obscured by this frosted window.
Yeah.
So you could kind of see what it was going to be like. I was like, okay. Then the first teaser poster was just this brick wall that was defaced with the Joker. And you're like, okay. And then the next poster, again, a full body Joker photo, but behind this frosted kind of window. And I just remember I was like, this just feels different. It feels different. And when that first trailer dropped, Christmas, or no, I think it was Thanksgiving or Christmas of 2007. And that first shot of the Joker as he licks his lips and he just looks up in the corner. It's from the scene after he just got the crap beat out of him by Batman in the jail. It was borderline terrifying. The sound effects they put on it, the way they edited it, I was like, oh my God, this is insane.
Well, this was slightly controversial too amongst Batman fans. The idea of doing a Joker that had just slathered makeup on himself, that wasn't perma white, as they call it, that hadn't fallen into a vat of chemicals. And it was just like, well, I mean, but you kind of had to know that wasn't going to play nice with the tone that they had established in the first one. And so it's just, and it's amazing how now you'll talk to so many people that pretend like they were always on board for that. And that's just not the case. Like that, I mean, especially before we started seeing the promotional images and everything, that there was just, well, I mean, do you remember how you felt when you heard that Heath Ledger had been cast?
I had a big question mark because I hadn't seen A Knight's Tale or 10 Things I Hate About. I didn't really know. I knew who he was, but to say like, oh yeah, I loved him in XYZ, I just hadn't seen him in anything. Yeah. But at that point, because Batman Begins had won me over so big, and I didn't know who Christian Bale was or Cillian Murphy, like they earned my trust in a way that I was like, okay. And then when I saw those first couple glimpses and just the way that they obscured him to make it look so much darker, I was like, I will trust you. I don't know what you're going to do with this, but I'm just going to go with it. I never was like, how dare you? Because anything that I fan casted, probably would have been the wrong tone for what that movie ended up being.
Yeah. He met with Nolan for Batman Begins for the role of Batman. And he had said that I'm not really interested in this. I don't really get this. But then he saw the movie, loved it. And then so when this came around, it was just like, okay, now this is something I would be very interested in doing. And it is one of those interpretations that it does two things so well. The first is that it's honoring aspects of the Joker from the comics that had never been depicted on film before. But the other great thing about this is then it leaves such an impression that this turns into one of those performances that then leaves a mark on every subsequent interpretation of the Joker, that they become inseparable. And there are a lot of new things he brought to this that are so in line and in spirit with other qualities of the Joker that you feel like they should have been there all along. They feel very, very organic. It's hard to even come up with anything that hasn't already been said about how incredible and transformative that performance is. But it's just like, the scene in the movie with the meeting of all the mobsters where he comes in, the first big Joker scene, where you really get a good look at him. I mean, just literally jaw dropped, just leaning forward in my seat, jaw dropped of just like, holy shit. I think, I suppose we'll get into our ranking of these movies a little bit later on, but the Joker is the very best thing in the entire trilogy for me. And it's crazy that the casting of Heath Ledger teaches you another valuable lesson about that whole idea of just wait and see. You don't like the Tumbler in these photos. Just wait and see how they use it in the film. And the same kind of thing with these casting choices, because the Batman movies, all of them, all the way back to 89, so many of them have always had these kind of bizarre casting choices or names that strike you as a little odd initially. And you just never know how it's going to go. Sometimes you get Heath Ledger as the Joker. Sometimes you get Jared Leto as the Joker. It is really exciting when these unconventional, not so obvious decisions just winding up paying off as well as this one does.
Yeah, this performance it's so confident and so powerful that I think it gets mistaken for definitive, as if this is the only way the Joker can be. It always makes me kind of irritated when people are like, Joker should never have an origin. I'm like, before this movie, Joker had many origins. Some of your favorite, Batman Mask of the Phantasm. He is just one of the goons for Maroni or whatever Italian last name mobster that they have in that movie. I can't remember anymore. So I definitely think that in the Dark Knight specifically, they do something kind of interesting. And I think why Heath Ledger's performance sticks out is because he's not so much a character as he is like the most entertaining plot device that there is, because he's not there to, he doesn't have any sort of an arc at all. He's literally just there to change other people. And that's why I think the Dark Knight, I batted back and forth, when we're talking about rating. First of all, I saw this movie 10 times in the theater. I collected my stubs. I think 5 of them were in full IMAX because I had never seen, I think this was one of the first movies, if not the first movie to shoot like sequences in full IMAX, which was just incredible at the time. But, I definitely think there was a point where everyone was like, this is the greatest comic book movie ever made. And then like anything, the backlash comes.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, it wasn't that good, as the years go by. And I think I bought into that a little bit, only because, as I said at the very beginning of all of this, I have such a love for the first 4 Batman movies that it became this weird, I call it new car smell thinking, where it was, those other ones suck. This is what it should be. It's like, why does this have to have anything to do with that? And I kind of got defensive against Dark Knight. Like, well, no, that's not the way. That's one way to do it, But watching all 3 of these again just last week, it's impossible for me to not get completely sucked up and wrapped up in this movie, to the point where even when I start to pick nits on this movie, it's usually after the movie's over and I'm sitting, it's like not actively looking for things,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you're absolutely right about the whole idea of definitive anything when we talk about these characters or the property itself. Like there's too many different versions of it. It means too many different things to too many different people. There is no one definitive version of Batman, of the Joker, of any of this. There are just different interpretations that work better at particular times. And there is this tendency in fandom. The term I always use is like recency bias, which is maybe not using that term correctly, but the same thing where whatever the newest thing is, that's the shiniest, that's the best. And in order to celebrate it, we build up by tearing down. You can't talk about how great The Dark Knight is without talking about how shitty the Tim Burton movies were. Like that kind of thing. That also drives me crazy. I'm in full agreement with you. But what you said about how your list of criticisms or issues, how that's not in your mind as you're watching it. I mean, that's the whole thing, not just with this movie, but with most Christopher Nolan movies. Like the momentum of his films, they distract you from thinking too hard about any of it in the moment. It isn't until you get home or maybe the next day that you start going, wait a minute, why did Gordon have to fake his death exactly? Or you start trying to walk yourself through the details of the Joker's plan and it's like, okay, wow. So none of this makes any sense. Okay.
Except Interstellar. I knew as I was watching this, I was like, I hate this, but that's another episode.
That's probably, I guess that might be my least favorite of all his movies. But, seeing this opening night, The Long Halloween, I mentioned that was an influence on Batman Begins. It's an even bigger one on this movie. That is one of my favorite Batman stories. So as a fan of that comic, I was really excited to see how many elements of that were being repurposed for this story. And there was just something about I was working at Starbucks at the time. I remember leaving my shift that afternoon, racing home to get changed, meet my friends at the theater. This whole big group of us went and sitting in a jam-packed, gigantic theater opening night. Again, like I said, there was like this electricity surrounding the hype for this movie, but just that experience, separate from the film itself, just seeing it, like there was electricity in the air. It was one of the most overwhelming movie-going experiences I've ever had. And I think that's just a great word to describe The Dark Knight. It's overwhelming. I don't think it's as tight as Batman Begins. I don't think all of this lands, but it's unquestionably a more visceral experience.
I definitely, and at least to my memory, and of course in your own memory, you kind of rewrite history as it fits the narrative that, shapes your story the best. But
yeah,
I remember this being the last time where I went to a big event where it was like, there was no reserved seats back then. I had my ticket. I got my ticket like months ahead of time, but I got in line to sit, with my ticket to sit in an IMAX theater opening night. I got in line at 7 a.m. and I was there till they let us in the theater at 11:30 p.m. and it was an all day party. There were hundreds of people out there. It was a block party for Batman. And since I was only 3 years old when Tim Burton's first Batman came out, this was my Batmania.
Yeah.
And so it felt very special to me. In retrospect, when I look at this, I think a lot of people who don't like this movie or criticize this movie a lot, one of their big things is, I hear a lot of this movie thinks that it's smarter than it is. I hear that a lot. And I really thought about that, especially on the second time around. And I was trying to really watch it as, from a different point of view and try to think like, is this a pretentious movie or whatever, or what is it trying to say? And what I think is so interesting about Dark Knight is that it does two things that, one which a Batman movie attempted and one which no Batman movie has attempted. The first was deconstructing Batman, which Batman Forever tried. As much as I love that movie, I will admit it's not super successful, but it does bring up that question of a person who does this. How long can they do this? What is the end goal when you make a pact like that to yourself, to be a symbol? So they did that, I feel like, in Dark Knight. They deconstructed Batman. But more interestingly, which I think actually sets this movie apart from any other comic book movie and why it is so brilliant, it deconstructs the thesis of Batman. if you have someone that does this, for every action, there is an equal but opposite reaction. If a man says, I am corruptible as a man, but as a symbol, I can be incorruptible. But if that symbol is still a man underneath it, can it be corrupted? That is not trying to deconstruct the character of Batman. That's deconstructing the entire philosophy, the concept of what a Batman could be. And I think that's why the Joker punches so hard, because he is going after the ideas of what we kind of conceive in our brains of like what Batman stands for. And it's kind of ugly at the end, because Batman is corrupted. He does compromise, and it's tough to watch your hero get in these choices that normally you would not see a comic book movie where, this is pre-Infinity War. You don't pre-Civil War, your hero didn't lose. Your villain did not get so deep into your hero's conscious that they cease to be that symbol of heroicness anymore. And this movie had the balls to not only put that out, but to put it out on the biggest screen possible and sell it as a summer movie with toys. It's insane to me that this movie got made the way it did.
Yeah, well, what you said about, is it pretentious and people criticizing it for being smarter than it thinks it's smarter than it actually is. I think, if there's one of the criticisms that has dogged Nolan's entire career is underwritten female characters. And I think that's a valid critique. Another thing is that, and something I myself have felt, is that he sometimes has a tendency to raise thematic questions without actually exploring them, that he just has these characters walk on screen as mouthpieces for a particular idea or point of view, and then that's sort of it. And I do think there are a couple of areas of The Dark Knight where it's just like they either don't fully explore a particular plot thread or in some cases just drop it completely. But David Fincher has said that you should really review films 10 years after they've been out. Like that's when you can really kind of come to a consensus on them, that it's almost unfair to judge them and form an opinion immediately. And so I've definitely had a journey with all three of these films. And I think maybe, I don't know, it's kind of a toss up which one is a more dramatic journey, this one or the next one. But I think part of what has softened me on a lot of the things that I also felt a little bit of the backlash. I was getting swept up in that at the time. But now seeing other movies with this character, what they've done with them. I do think The Dark Knight is a movie that has something on its mind. And I do think Nolan is a filmmaker who is legitimately trying to say something about ideas that he cares about. And when you compare that to a Batman movie that really wants you to think it's like, it's deep and ponderous, but just kind of disappears completely up its own ass, I think that really does help highlight just how unique and effective this take was.
Yeah, I think one of the most compelling scenes, and this speaks to the performances, the everything about the script, everything about this movie. I think one of the most compelling scenes in this entire trilogy is literally just Batman and Joker talking, face to face at a table. Just a conversation. And it's the most fascinating conversation. And the Joker literally lays out exactly what's going to happen for the rest of the movie, whether you realize it at the time or not. He's like, just watch. When things get really bad, yeah, they need you now. But the minute that they can turn against you, they will. And they do. And the minute that people can make a bad choice, some won't, but most will. Just watch. I'll show you, Nolan said that scene is like kind of the fulcrum on which the whole movie spins. And another thing that I had never heard before until very recently was that was one of the first Joker scenes they shot. Heath Ledger wanted to come in and just tackle one of the big important scenes right out of the gate. And Nolan said that a lot of the crew they were using that day, they had also worked on the 89 movie. And they were kind of protective about that version of the Joker. And Nicholson's performance was kind of looming large.
And Nolan said it was fun to watch them come around from being very defensive to really embracing what Heath Ledger was doing once they saw it. And I love it for all the reasons you just said. And there's also even just quick moments, the way he delivers that line of like, don't talk like one of them, you're not. Like just calling Batman out. It's just like, it's such a weird line, but I actually just got goosebumps thinking about it right now. And you know what other moment I really love is at the very end, after he has captured the Joker, and Joker's saying like, but Harvey was my ace in the hole. Did you think I was going to risk the battle for Gotham Soul on a fist fight with you? And there's this point in that conversation where Batman just looks utterly exhausted, where he just puts his head down, and you can just, everything about his body language is screaming like, I just can't. I've got nothing left. Like this guy has just utterly gutted me. That is part of what you said about, the hero being defeated. That is not a moment I've seen in many comic book movies before or since. Like what an amazing relationship they had. And it's like they leave the Joker alive for a reason. And there's this insinuation about like, we're destined to do this forever. And it's so heartbreaking the way things worked out that you have to imagine that in a world where Heath Ledger hadn't died, that the third film, it winds up being, it's just probably a completely different looking movie. And he had to have been included in it in some capacity.
And I know that was the plan. It was definitely to bring Heath Ledger back. And I have to say, I don't think it would have been as successful the second time around. I think the reason why the Joker is so powerful is because he comes into Gotham like a tornado. He undiscriminately causes damage, changes the status quo, and then it's like, peace out, deal with that. And I feel like that makes him more effective. I think if we had seen him in the third movie, there's kind of nowhere else for him to go, because as we've already said, he's not truly a character so much as he is kind of like, a catalyst for other characters to grow. And I don't know if he would have been as effective a second time around.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about. And what we had said about what we like so much about Batman Begins is how self-contained it is. That even though these three films do amount to a trilogy and a larger story about Bruce Wayne, that there is something really nice about wrapping up some of these other arcs. Because I know people had the same problem with Two-Face. Why did you blow your wad on Two-Face in the last 20 minutes of this when he deserved his own film? And I think that was Goyer's original plan. Have the transformation happen at the end of this, and then the third film, Two-Face takes center stage and the Joker factors in somehow again and whatever. But although I do think the Two-Face stuff is a little bit rushed, and this is another character I'm not sure they've ever cracked in live action. The Harvey Dent stuff is amazing, but once he actually turns into Two-Face, I do have a few issues with that. But I understand why Nolan decided that, like, no, that story is going to end here, because Bruce Wayne doesn't arc as heavily in this film, that they decided that Harvey Dent was really the protagonist of this story, the rise and fall of Harvey Dent. So as upset as I know a lot of fans still are about them taking Two-Face out the way they did, I do see what they were going for. And I think it speaks to kind of what you were just saying about the Joker as well, that it's just the idea of stretching this on, of acting like this was just the appetizer for something we're going to do down the road, and versus like, no, you have a complete definitive experience with this one movie. I mean,
because in my mind, it always was like, people are like, well, Bane lets all those people out of jail in The Dark Knight Rises. Wouldn't it have been great to see the Joker? I was like, one of two things in my head canon. One, even Bane knows that Joker's too much and is not going to let that guy out. Or two, which is probably more likely, Joker got Jeffrey Epstein real quick as soon as he was put away, because he killed a lot of cops and he did it gleefully. And that's why I don't think this Joker lasted too much longer after this.
There is something very haunting about what you said about that he shows up out of nowhere, that Nolan's whole idea was he just arrives as an absolute. And that's such a great take on the Joker. And then that he just disappears the same way. And then not knowing, I think you're right. I think that actually is a lot creepier and a lot cooler. There are so many people, this still pops up on Reddit all the time. People that they'll say this as if it's a fact, that if Heath Ledger hadn't died, the Joker would have been the judge instead of Scarecrow. in the scene of all the sentencing.
That would have been awful.
That also is absolutely 100% not true, because that version of the third movie did not exist before Heath Ledger died. And if he hadn't, and if they had made the decision to carry on with the Joker, we're talking about a radically different third film. We're not talking about plugging him into the film that exists. We're talking about something 100% different from what we got. The Joker was not going to be the judge. Stop perpetuating that. It is not true.
Yeah, trust me, with the Star Wars fandom community, we get all those types of like, well, if this, then that. I'm like, you're a terrible armchair quarterback there. But I truly hold that that's what, just exactly what you just said, is that this Joker is special and scary because he comes out of nowhere, causes a lot of damage, intentionally breaks the status quo, undoes everything that we just watched a whole movie of Bruce change his whole life for this mission. And for someone to come in and by the end of that movie be like, your mission was never possible. It's just not going to happen. That's not the way it is. Bye.
Yeah.
And then leave.
Yeah.
Like in a strange way, they kind of wrote themselves into a corner with that ending. Because when you set out and your thesis statement is what happens when a man becomes more than a man, he becomes a symbol. And by the end of your second movie, you say that symbol doesn't stand for anything anymore. Where do you go in the third movie? I mean, there's a lot of interesting opportunities, and we'll get to that. But I definitely think that ending of The Dark Knight is almost like a very sad unwinding and undoing of everything that had been built up to that point. And I think that's why it hits so hard, is because, like the mission of being Batman is failed. It's a failed mission.
The ending of the movie, this is another one where when the title comes up, it hits. Like you feel it in your gut. And instead of the celebratory, you want to stand up and cheer of Batman Begins coming on the screen, this is just, there's a tragedy to, they've set Dent up as the White Knight. And then this whole idea of Batman is not a hero, that he's something bigger than that. He's whatever the city needs him to be. And you get that great closing moment with Gordon telling his son about, like, we have to chase him. We have to hunt him. And then this is who he is. This is what our city needs right now. He's our Dark Knight. Cut to black. The words come on screen. And it just, like, every time I watch it, it really hits you. It's another deliberate decision by Nolan to put the title at the end of the film where it's really going to make the most impact. And instead of just being like, yeah, it's cool because it's one of Batman's, like, nicknames. It's one of the things they call him. It's like an edgy sort of sounding thing. And instead they put it at the end and you're just like, shit. Like, this is, did we win?
It's so great. It's such a, that play on words of the White Knight turning dark on a Dark Knight for Gotham. And now you have the Dark Knight as your protector. I love all of that. I think it all works. It's just, you're right. It's such like a melancholy, because even in your mind, if it ended there, you're like, okay, well, I guess there'll be peace now, all built on a lie. Like my hero literally had to compromise his integrity and his principles more than once to get the job done. And that's exactly what the Joker wanted. And I think that's great.
What you said about how they kind of write themselves in a corner, that is something I think is kind of fun about Nolan's whole idea of, first of all, I don't think he is as aggressive about this as he claims, about like, we do one at a time. There's absolutely no thought about what comes next. I don't know that that's necessarily true. I know that him and Goyer did plot out a very loose structure for a trilogy when they first started writing Batman Begins, and at a certain point made the decision, we're just going to concentrate on this one. If we don't get to do more, let's make sure we put everything we want in a Batman movie in this one. I think that was the right call. And then they do the same thing here. I think there must have been loose ideas, and certainly those all went out the window for after this one when Heath Ledger died. But I do think prior to that, there was kind of a loose idea of a 3-film arc specifically for Bruce Wayne. Maybe not so much the villains, but definitely Bruce. And
unless they were just like the How I Met Your Mother writing staff that's like, let's put a donkey in this and then we'll have to figure out 2 years later what it means, And
there'll be a flashback for this moment you didn't see in the first movie where this donkey was like really important. But I think that's kind of great to then just give yourself the challenge of Yeah, I don't know. I guess we'll figure it out when we get there. Like that can be kind of exciting. Like I said, there are other areas where I think it bites him in the ass a little bit, but wonderful things are also come out of that decision. And it's the right way to go. And quite frankly, we're still at a point where, like it's not enough that we try to kickstart like a new IP or a new franchise. It's like before they've even started writing the movie, they're announcing this is a trilogy. This is the first of a trilogy. And how many times that doesn't pan out because you didn't focus on telling one good story first. That it's like the idea of using these things to tee up other movies. I mean, that Tom Cruise Mummy movie is one of the biggest offenders I can think of in recent memory, where it's just like, don't be so concerned with setting up a franchise. Just tell me a good fucking story, please. Just do that first. And then if you do that, you'll earn my interest for the next one, because that's not how Batman Begins plays at all. And it's not how The Dark Knight plays at all. It doesn't feel like it's leaving you these breadcrumbs of like, see, that's where we're headed.
I definitely think that, we've talked a lot about Two-Face. So let's talk a little bit about Aaron Eckhart. He's kind of the big addition to the cast besides Heath Ledger's Joker. I'm with you. You said it earlier. I really love his Harvey Dent. I don't even hate his Two-Face. In fact, like, I still think like, yeah, it's the only link to what I said I liked before with Batman Begins of like, it's a little cartoony and comic booky, but just enough that I'm like, oh, that's a cool interpretation of that character in this world. Where it loses me, I'm on board with this version of Two-Face all the way up until he points the gun at the kid. And then I'm like, you just went from 0 to 100 so fast that I never want, like, yes, you're upset, your girlfriend's dead, not even fiance yet, your girlfriend's dead, and you're willing to turn a gun on a kid so fast, unless like you are on a ridiculous amount of morphine and you're not 100% cognizant of what you're doing. This just feels like one step too far in the de-evolution of Harvey Dent.
Yeah, I think some of the most successful versions of Two-Face are the ones where you feel him being conflicted over the coin, the relationship with the coin, that he is kind of a slave to this. And that tortured Two-Face is a much better character than the one who is just kind of a violent psychopath, because they have to kind of rush this part of the story. And something that drives me crazy about Batman Forever, I mean, separate from Tommy Lee Jones, the way he decided to play it, but it's the idea that the coin, it doesn't mean anything. He just keeps flipping it until he gets the result that he wants. And that's not Two-Face. And in this one, there are other moments, it never goes that far, but it's like, okay, he's not going to kill Eric Roberts' character, but he's going to flip it again, and now he's going to kill the driver, so I'm still going to kill you, but I'm just going to do it this other way. That there's no more about like, I wish there had been more of this is what the coin says, and the psyche being so tied to that I can see a moment then where the coin flips and it's like, and that means the kid, and he doesn't want to do it. You can see the conflict, but it's just like, that not only makes him a more interesting villain, I think it actually makes him a much scarier one too, than one who just walks around saying kind of like half-baked dialogue about like, meet me where my family died. Like, I don't know.
It's a little like Taken 2, some of the, but the thing is too, it's like, that's what's like, I'm conflicted because within that same scene that I don't like, he has some brilliant moments. I love when he just callously, with no effort, shoots Batman because that's what the coin says. He's like, oh, boom, you're dead.
Yeah.
Me next. How crazy would it have been if he had to kill himself and the whole thing was just over? You save yourself for last, dude. What are you doing? But I do love, I do love that there's something very poetic, borderline like Shakespearean. Like one of my favorite lines where he's like, we were decent men in indecent times. Like, I think that poor Aaron Eckhart was saddled with some of the most over the top obtuse lines in this movie, and yet he delivered all of them really, really effectively. I think you either, what is it? You die a hero, live long enough to see yourself become a villain. was a line written to specifically be put in a trailer.
It's nonsense. Yeah.
But the fact that he can say it with a straight face and make me believe that he believes that is incredible, you know?
Yeah, well, I know there are people that have issues with this last moment with Two-Face. They feel like it's tacked on. Not him becoming Two-Face, but specifically this last scene with him and Batman and Gordon. And that's one of the things I love so much about the movie is the Batman, Gordon, Dent, that relationship is the center of The Long Halloween, and it's the center of this movie. And I think for the most part, personal preference, I like when Harvey Dent and Bruce Wayne are closer friends, not romantic rivals. I don't like that they turn that into a love triangle, but that's small potatoes. That's not a major grievance. For the most part, I think they do such an amazing job of making that the center of the film. And I like this last moment. I like that you have your big, explosive, traditional summer blockbuster climax with the Joker. And then it's like, but the story's not over. And you have this much quieter, more somber, and in some ways more tense showdown at the very end. I actually really dig that about the movie. I don't think it affects the pacing at all, like at least for me. And this is also maybe one of the best tracks on this score, which is like, I mean, and that is saying something, but it's the whole, it's like a 7 or 8 minute long piece of music that just goes through this whole final part of the movie. And man, it like really hits you. Even when I listen to it separate from the film, it's just a really, really amazing piece of music that's so good you don't even notice it, which is what a good score should do. And
it just builds that tension.
Absolutely. And just very quickly on that note, one thing on that note, oh, thank you, Bill, is that so when Batman Begins came out and everybody was sort of like, yeah, it was great and the score was really rousing, but we kind of miss having a very strong, memorable Batman theme. And what Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard said at the time was, well, he just became Batman by the end of the movie. He hasn't earned the big superhero theme yet. It's going to evolve over the course of subsequent films. And I thought, wow, what a great idea. That's kind of cool, actually. And then what wound up happening instead was because of the approach Nolan took with this one, visually, tonally, they realized that a lot of the themes they had written for the previous movie did not work with this one. And that's why, one of the Batman themes is like that bum, 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 bum. And it's all over Batman Begins. You only hear it twice in The Dark Knight and very fleetingly. So it's just on the one hand, I kind of regret that we didn't get whatever big Batman theme Hans Zimmer says he was building to. On the other hand, I think one of the things that's great about all three of these films is that it's like, as they go along, what you can feel the music doing is, it's trying to boil all of these characters down to their essential essence, which is fitting because it's, what Nolan is sort of doing with his approach to the filmmaking as well. And so Batman has a very sparse theme. One of the major Batman themes is just 2 notes. And sometimes it ends on a major key and sometimes it ends on a minor key. And that's it. The Joker obviously is just that one, that like frequency almost, that it's like, it's not even music. When you get into the Catwoman stuff in the next film, it's just a few piano notes. Da-da-da. Da-da-da, bum-ba. I really love that he wrote these big epic scores, but took a less is more approach to them. And that's something I had to come around on. I didn't love that initially, but that's something that's really grown on me. And he does such a good job of making the score invisible that on that first viewing, you are just so totally in it. And I think this last scene, if anyone listening, if you've never paid attention to the music in that last scene of The Dark Knight, go back. It's amazing.
It's probably the scene where the music is dialed up the most, because when you really watch this movie, a lot of those big scenes, they pulled the music out entirely. Like that whole kind of, transporting Dent on the truck thing. There's not much, if any, score during all of that, which just makes it feel more visceral, more real, so that when you get to this point that you're just like, is he really going to shoot this kid? Which, by the way, if you really wanted to make a moment, you take his wife and it's like, sorry, kids, you're going to have to watch this. But if my girl died, your girl's got to die. I think that's a little bit more in line with, like, I could have bought that more then I'm going to go straight for your 6-year-old, or whatever.
The great thing about that moment, though, is that little kid now for the rest of his life gets to tell his baby sister, Dad loves me so much more than you.
Right. I mean, Two-Face said it, man.
He smelled it on him. Dad didn't even have to say it. That's how much he loves me.
Suck it, Batgirl.
Well, really quick. So when we were talking about the costume in Batman Begins, you said that's your favorite batsuit.
Yeah.
So were you kind of mixed on this one?
I'm not a huge fan of this one. It's a little too busy for my tastes.
Yeah.
It feels like it's tchotchke, like a million pieces tchotchked onto a bodysuit.
Yeah.
It looks really neat, but it doesn't feel as functional as the first one in terms of why would that divot? Why would that groove be there? Why is that piece separate? It doesn't make sense to me.
I remember when they put the first picture of it out of him standing on the cop car, and I just thought okay. I don't know that I need Batman to look like RoboCop in a cape. This is not my favorite version of it.
But I know that photo that you're talking about, and to your point, to echo it, context, because it did not look that pronounced in the film itself.
No. And I think, especially compared to the next movie, I think they're very smart about how they photograph it in this one and kind of shoot around some of its limitations. But yeah, I'm not a fan of the overly militaristic looking bat suits. I really think that this isn't like the music. There's sort of a less is more approach that I would like to see them take at some point with these live action movies that this one especially though, it's a little bit much for me. This is not one of my favorite batsuits.
We talked earlier about Michael Caine and Alfred, and I said he's going to get some moments later on. I think his performance is so good in this movie. I do think Alfred is a little wishy-washy in this movie in terms of just oh, don't be Batman. Oh, but you have to be Batman. You might want to think about being Batman. I've seen this movie so many times, and I still don't quite know how Alfred feels about Batman and Bruce being Batman during the run of this movie. I just feel like it's, and maybe it's just me and I'm overthinking it, but it just seems like Alfred is a little bit of a Kent parent from the Man of Steel movie where it's huh? What do you want me to do? I don't understand.
That's valid. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and if he's conflicted, then that kind of needs to be the point rather than having this point of view the first time we see Alfred and then this other point of view a little bit later on.
And he's going to have a radically different view. Granted, 8 years has passed in the next one, but it's just that's the one thing where it's Alfred buys into the Batman thing almost suspiciously quick in Batman Begins. He puts up no argument whatsoever, Master Bruce, maybe we should get you checked out. And then this one, I feel like it's as the scene calls for it. And again, this is where I say all three of these movies, for me, there are script issues, and I don't mean structurally. I mean sometimes the dialogue that Alfred says is just so bizarre. Or just a person wouldn't say that. He's that's exactly what he's doing. He's not being a hero. I'm just who are you talking to?
It's Alfred is just theme stated. That's just, yeah.
But then again, you get that and I'm just but I think some of the most compelling dialogue and chilling dialogue in the whole movie is his story about the jewels that were stolen back in the day, Yeah. And usually that's a lot of times in movies, that's when I drift just a little bit when a character, I know it's oh, here comes your monologue and I'm sure this is important, but let me look around the scene. This was a really compelling story, and I believed that he was there, and that it didn't feel like dialogue. It felt hey, I know this type of guy. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I don't know if I'm articulating that well.
No, I know exactly.
It didn't feel like a story that a writer thought up that would connect. It felt like a real story.
Yes, and I think there is a moment in the third movie that is the exact opposite of what you're describing. Yes. A moment with Alfred where there is a right way to do this and a wrong way to do this. And this one, it's integrated perfectly and they don't waste too much time on it. And the culmination of it, when it comes back into play later and and Bruce asks, how did you beat him? We burned the forest down. That's a chilling moment.
Yeah, and that's where I think like the strengths of this movie lie, is that the good is so good that the bad, because I mean, Christopher Nolan has a real problem with casting extras, and a lot of times it'll take one extra.
I think I know who you're gonna single out.
Things are worse than ever.
Oh man.
That, and then there's a guy, when someone says no more dead cops, there is a guy, there's a podcast, so you can't see my face, but he's just like,
I hadn't thought of that, but I think you're right. I think that might be preferable.
And it's just like that's why like I'm starting to believe that Christopher Nolan casts his movies so well, because he just has to admit to himself, like, I'm not really going to coach you on the acting. That's going to be you. I'm going to deal with the other stuff, because a lot of times there are performances in all three of these movies that I'm like, that had to have been your practice take. There's no way that you did more than one of those and chose that take to put in this movie. It couldn't be.
You know who else gets singled out a lot is the SWAT guy that's riding in the van with Gordon.
Oh, this is not good.
Okay, that's not good. Yeah. So that actor, Nicky Katt is his name. He's the guy in Dazed and Confused that picks a fight with Anthony Rapp, the really aggro, like, or not Anthony Rapp, Adam. Oh no, I forgot the actor's name. If people have seen the movie, they know the moment I'm talking about. Trent, I think, is the character's name. But he's also in Batman and Robin. He is one of the other racers in that motorcycle scene that trash talks Barbara, where she's like, how much you got? How much you got? When they're making that wager before the race. Spike.
So he's been consistently terrible in Batman movies for years.
And if this guy is in or on a vehicle in your Batman movie, something terrible is about to happen. Well, if you're watching Batman and Robin, something terrible is always about to happen. But that's kind of crazy. Same dude.
Yeah, I mean, those are the moments where it's like, to this day, that press conference, I don't know if I've ever truly paid attention to it, because I'm so taken out by the extras in it that it just loses something. I cannot unsee that guy's face.
I know
can't unsee it.
It's the next movie, but as long as we're talking about extras, the next time you watch The Dark Knight Rises, when Bruce finally makes it out of the pit and all the guys are down there cheering for him, there is one guy in the second row of extras who, it's like, he was unfamiliar with the concept of like, what do you mean, like, pump my fist? What is that? Is it like around in a circle like this? No, the other way. Like this. And he's like, I swear to God, he very nearly looks at the camera at one point, and he's looking around at all the other guys, like, what are we doing here? And he's so much taller. You won't be able to miss him the next time you watch it. But that one always pulls me out too. This big rousing moment. And I'm just like, who is the alien dressed in a human suit that hasn't figured
cranking.
this?
Yeah, there's definitely some, like, they're funky extras, but again, like, you get like a character actor, like the guy, unfortunately I don't know his actual name, but you get the guy who plays like Wirtz is so good. Like, I believe every word that comes out of that guy's mouth, and Ramirez, and they actually managed to make Eric Roberts look like an actor in this, which is insane. That was a strange choice. When I was like, Eric, that can't be right. That's got to be like a different Eric Roberts, right? Like, Mr. Redbox is in this.
Well,
Mr.
I mean, there's
BTV?
a lot of straight-to-video guys that Michael Jai White is in this movie. I kind of love that he filled these smaller roles with.
Have I ever told you this is so when I used to work at Wizard World Comic Con, we were at Chicago Comic Con, and it was middle of the day. I had to poop so bad, and I ran all around the convention center, just people in costumes and lines. I was like, I'm not gonna make it, so I was like, I'll go to the celebrity bathroom, and it was not a good one. And I came out at the same time as Michael J. White, and he just kind of gave me this look like, yeah, I know what just happened. And we just never spoke of it for the rest of the time. I don't know why I felt the need to share that story, but pooping in front of Spawn is a hard thing to do.
That's amazing.
Just felt like everyone needed to know that that happened. but I was running around like Adam West Batman with a bomb.
Some
you
days
know, couldn't find a bathroom.
Can't get rid of a bomb.
Some days you just can't get rid of a turd. You just have to poop it from a spawn. There's nothing you can do. But yes, we're directed to you. Sorry, I just.
If you want to go into poop stories, we will be here all night. I got a million of them.
That's why I subscribe to your podcast. There's been a succinct lack of poop stories in your show lately, so
they talked about the first two movies extensively, and then it was like 2.5 more hours, and it was just poop stories. I was eating. I can't. I'm sorry. You know, something I wanted to make sure and mention was that when we were talking about how stylized Batman Begins is in comparison to the other two, I know that they talked a lot about the Michael Mann influence on this film, specifically Heat.
Right.
But also going into Batman Begins, Nolan was a little nervous about how people were going to react to how grounded they had made everything and how matter-of-factly so much of it was presented. But because the response was good, that really empowered them to take it even further for The Dark Knight. And they said, this is like, I'm pretty sure this is an exact quote. They wanted to take the Gothic out of Gotham City. And I see what they're going for. I respect that. I've already mentioned my personal preference is It's the opposite. I like when Gotham's a character. And I think cinematically speaking, if you've got Tim Burton's Batman on one end of the spectrum and then Christopher Nolan's on the other end, I really think my ideal take would be somewhere in the middle. I want it to be a little more mythic and a little bit more stylized. So I do miss that in The Dark Knight. And I think sometimes the more you try to legitimize Batman, the more ridiculous he can start to feel. But this is Nolan's take. That's his prerogative. And even if I don't fully agree with all of this, all of his choices, I mean, they are all still valid. This is just 100% unfiltered, uncompromised Nolan. This is what he was going for, and this is what he did. So there was a lot about this movie that doesn't make any damn sense, but I'm in agreement with you that the stuff it gets right, it gets it so right that it almost feels silly to dwell on the things that don't totally work.
There's like, that very first shot of Heath Ledger from the back, and he's standing holding his mask. There's a train that goes by, and I have no idea if that's actually, it probably actually is there in Chicago.
It is, yeah.
But I just, in my head I'm like, okay, that's the train from the last movie. They rebuilt it.
A couple of very fleeting moments where you can see that train from the previous movie, where I think the first time you get that aerial shot moving in on Bruce's penthouse right before the party. You can see the train off in the corner going by. That is not a real train. That's the CGI one they added. So it's like, but the most glaring thing is there's a new building for Wayne Enterprises in this one. In the previous film, it was the Chicago Board of Trade, which is a very distinctive looking building. So when it makes a pretty big appearance in this film as well, and in the previous film, not only did we see the front of that building, but we saw how the train just went like right up to it. And now just an empty street, pretend that wasn't Wayne Enterprises in the last one.
Yeah, and it's probably got to be, unfortunately, like a little bit tougher for you because, it's still a version of Gotham for me. Not my preferred, but it's still a city I don't know. This would be like if they did it, in Burbank or West Hollywood, watching Batman. I'd be like, well, clearly that is not like the suspension of disbelief must be harder, for you living in that Chicago area.
It is one of the things that is simultaneously really cool about the film is that this is our home. We walk down a lot of these streets, and then something that I think maybe is a little bit of an obstacle of fully buying in. Although, I don't know, I have to say that I think, and I'm very biased, but I think Chicago makes a much better Gotham City than Pittsburgh and, where they shot a lot of the next one. But I'll shatter one particular illusion for you. Bruce's penthouse, it is the ground floor of a building that is right next to the Hyatt Hotel in downtown Chicago, right by on Upper Wacker there. And it's just all green screen around those windows on the first floor. But I mean, it is seamless. You would never know if you didn't walk past that building.
Right. I mean, so my wife, she went to Columbia, and she was in Chicago when they were shooting this. So she likes to point out, oh, that's this place. That's place. I'm like, no, it's Gotham. Stop talking.
Yeah.
She's like, no, I was there when they filmed. I was like, no, you weren't. It's in Gotham. It doesn't exist. I think, the other thing, and I've touched upon it a couple times, but I can't overstate, like, I truly do love that, probably more than any other Batman movie. Batman is pushed in this movie to his, not his physical limits, but his ethical limits. And I love that exchange with Lucius Fox, where, he walks in and he's like, this is a beautiful and amazing, and this is wrong. What are you doing, man? Yeah. And I think that's kind of a lot of people came out of this movie saying that this was like a critique on the Patriot Act and,
yes,
very political. And Nolan's like, nope, this is not a political commentary. I don't know if I 100% believe that, even if it on a subconscious level, it kind of seeped in. But I do like this idea, probably because in the last 20 years, I feel like Batman has almost been deified in a lot of the comics and a lot of the interpretations, where it's like he can do no wrong. He's unkillable. He's brilliant to the point of there's no problem he can't solve. So I kind of like that his ethics, his morals are challenged, because he's like, I've got to stop this. It's for a greater good. But is it? Do you, this is essentially, you wanted to become Batman because Batman can't be corrupted, but you yourself are corrupting Batman to keep the peace. I think that's such an interesting ethical question. And I know you said earlier, a lot of times Nolan and Goyer together, they have this penchant for bringing up these questions and just leaving them dangling. But I kind of feel like they maybe didn't solve it, but they definitely made me think about it. And I think that was enough for me. I don't know what your thoughts are.
No, I think that's fair. I know that circa 2008, that moment with Lucius about like it's unethical and it's wrong, that the character might feel that way, but it's the movie does not agree with him, that the ends do justify the means in this case. I have since come around on this idea of that, like, one of the things, the ideas that Nolan may have, that may have really grabbed him. And I think what you said about it maybe even being subconscious, that this stuff is in the zeitgeist. And sometimes this is how ideas work when you're writing. You don't always initially know what it is about a story that is speaking to you, or why it kind of sticks around. And it gets to a point where you just feel like you have to write this, why you feel compelled to. And sometimes over the course of writing it, that's when you discover, oh, that's what this is about. So I do believe him when he says this is not, we're not taking a hard political stance here, or it's not meant to be such an explicit allegory for these other real world events. But man, there's so much post 9/11 anxiety in this movie. There's no way that doesn't seep in and that this isn't a part of it. And so the idea that at the end of this film, part of being a leader, part of being Batman means having to make, kind of like the wrong choice sometimes for the greater good. I think that is a really powerful idea. I think the movie would be better if it just underlined that point a little bit more, because there is a very brief exchange at the end of The Long Halloween where Gordon and Batman are discussing the fate of Harvey Dent, and this whole idea of, we got what we wanted, but we won technically, but look at the price we paid, and was this worth it? And Gordon says something to Batman to the effect of, like, if you're asking me if we won, yes, we did, we won. But I'm not going to know if it was worth it for a very long time. If the whole idea at the end of this movie was, this is our move, this is what we're going to have to do, but in some ways, the Joker is won here. You've been forced to compromise what the essence of Batman was supposed to be.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, too, that, you have to remember the landscape was so different in 2008 in terms of superhero movies, that the idea of tasking a superhero with taking responsibility for their actions, we think of Captain America Civil War, but that's, 15, 16 movies into their universe and almost 10 years later. This is the second movie in this Batman trilogy, and we're asking questions that have never been asked of a superhero movie before, really taking a hard look at what does it mean to be a hero on a very real level, not just strapping on the cape and saving the day, but you have to make real sacrifices and real choices. And sometimes those sacrifices, you're doing one wrong to prevent a worse wrong, like those really hard questions. So I think that's what I give Dark Knight a lot of credit for, is taking the deity that had become Batman and honestly kind of knocking him down a peg and making him human again and making him make a decision that I don't agree with, and that leaves Gotham in a state that there's peace now, but like you said, I don't know if it can last on the basis of a lie. And that's such an interesting place to walk out of the movie, but it's also a very strange place to walk out of, like emotionally walk out of that movie, because you're like, yeah. I feel like the ending in a way emotionally is much closer to Batman Returns, where people walked out a little shell shocked, it just so happened that this one was, connected a little bit better, maybe an understatement, with people than the other one did.
Well, like I said, timing is everything, and just the anxieties that were still very much at the forefront of our culture at that point. This movie tapped into all of that, and I think if you're gonna explore moral gray areas and complexities and how sometimes it's just you can't really be fully good or fully evil, that Batman is the character to explore those ideas. He's perfect for that, and I think they do really the notion of being more than a hero, that is seeded. They do a good job of seeding that earlier on in the film. It doesn't come out of nowhere. And I think Nolan, I can see him being more excited by like summing this up, tying a bow on it and this was the point. I can see him being less excited about that and more excited about the idea of people walking out of that theater and turning to one another and saying like, do you think that technology, that's how he caught the Joker. Do you think that was the right thing to do? And you're having a conversation about Batman, but what you're really having a conversation about are these people in positions of authority and of leadership that we have sort of ordained to take on certain roles, kind of acknowledging that it is a very complicated thing, that it isn't black and white, and it's not good or evil, that there is like part of these positions is having to make really unpopular decisions, and sometimes doing the right thing in a weird way means doing the wrong thing. And I can see him being really fired up about that, of just the conversation that is ongoing after the movie is over.
Yeah, there's definitely some logic holes to the point where I don't know if anyone's truly cracked Gordon's math at the end, where it's 5 dead cops, 5 dead people, 3 of them, you're just like, wait a second, who, how, what? There's definitely a lot of like, Ocean's 11 logic, like, oof, the stars had to have aligned for all this to happen. But I think in 2008, we collectively called this movie brilliant. And I think in 2020, I think it's earned that moniker. I think it gets to stay brilliant, and you can definitely dislike it and you can definitely have your criticisms, but to take away from what this movie was, what this movie is for the whole genre, I think is just, it's like a cultural, just like we hate things that are popular.
Yeah. I get why this one is the fan favorite. It's bigger in scope and in ambition than Batman Begins. One of my favorite things about Batman Begins is how tight that script is, how thematically sound the whole thing is. The Dark Knight, it's more ambitious, but it's also a lot more unwieldy. It's got some bloat to it. And there are certain plot threads, like I said, that I feel maybe aren't fully explored. But ultimately, I think this is a movie that is more than the sum of its parts. Even when it feels like it's about to crumble under the weight of all that ambition, it holds it together in a way that the third one, frankly, does not. And I think maybe for me specifically, the Joker is what holds this one together.
What's just out of curiosity, what's a plot thread that you feel like they
is
kind of abandoned?
Underdeveloped? The pretend Batman is the first one that comes to mind.
Definitely. Yeah. And it's so interesting too, because it's, I always thought it was strange the way they worded it in Batman Begins, that he wants to inspire people. I'm like, that's not the first word that I would use when I think of Batman. He's not that's Superman,
Yeah.
So when Alfred's like, he's like, there were copycats. It's like, well, you want to inspire people. It's like, that's not what I had in mind. It's like, what did you have in mind, man? That seems like you wanted people to take back their city. This is the only way that you've shown them it works. Like, yeah, I 100% agree with you, that the theme of escalation is there in terms of like, if people see this is working and they're inspired, they're going to do it too. And it definitely works as a device for the Joker to kind of intertwine with Batman. But yeah, I would have loved to have seen the, if this, then what, for a whole scope of things. They say they pay lip service so much to Batman change things. It's like, okay, well, let's see it in other facets too. We get a great montage at the start of just like, nah, man, not tonight, and I love that when it's like, is he going to come? He's like, most nights he doesn't, but I just like people thinking he's out there, like the boogeyman. That's great. That's all great stuff. But then it's like, yeah, we do have so much challenging thematic material that we kind of have to hit the ground running after that.
Yeah. I think the Mason Reese thing is another thing that it's like, are we really going to
Coleman Reese stuff?
Or Coleman, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Mason, who is Mason Reese? That's a character in something.
If not, you put him in one of your new movies or scripts.
That's definitely, as soon as we stop recording, I'm going to remember it and be like, what in the world? And the whole thing about like, oh, is that the Riddler? Because Mr. Reese. But even that feels like, we're really going to dedicate, we've got all of these other plates spinning and we're going to stop to do this now. And I get that it winds up serving a function and it allows us to, this other facet of the Joker, comes through at the culmination of all of that. But it's like I said, the movie's got a little bit of bloat on it.
No, you're totally right. And I totally hear you. There is a little bit of bloat. I mean, you could say it has a little bit of a cinematic dad bod, if you will. I just think, this movie has a reputation of being, the cream of the crop. And I think, ultimately it definitely earned that reputation.
I think its reputation is very well deserved. And Billy, before we get out of here, Mason Reese was a child actor who looks like a Batman villain. That's where I don't know why that name was on my brain, but it feels so good to scratch that itch. Oh my God.
I was like, was this the kid that you stole a Batman toy from? What is this? Well, I'm glad that this is kind of a cliffhanger. We're coming back next week, but I'm glad we don't have to have that be a cliffhanger.
It's like a Nolan Batman movie. We close the loop. It's its own separate thing. There it is.
Like I said, today we covered Batman Begins and Dark Knight. Next week, we are going to finish out the trilogy. We are talking The Dark Knight Rises. Plus, we're also going to talk about the legacy of this entire trilogy. So definitely come back next week. Chris, you'll be back. Same bat time, same bat channel. See you next week.